The ribbons were packed away, the nameplate long gone. She walked into the courtroom in plain clothes, just another face in the crowd. But one by one, the veterans stood. Then the bailiff. Then the judge, saluting not the woman in civilian clothes, but the warrior they all remembered. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If you enjoy stories about honor that transcends uniforms and respect that runs deeper than rank, consider subscribing for more content that explores how true leadership leaves marks that no discharge papers can erase. The marble steps of the federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. gleamed under the September afternoon sun as Rebecca Martinez adjusted the strap of her worn leather handbag and checked her watch for the third time in 5 minutes. At 42, she moved with the efficient precision of someone accustomed to being exactly where she needed to be, exactly when she needed to be there, but today felt different. Today marked her first time inside a federal building since the ceremony 18 months ago, when she had surrendered her commission and walked away from 22 years of military service. Her navy blue pantsuit was conservative and unremarkable, the kind of outfit worn by thousands of government workers, lawyers, and witnesses who pass through these halls daily. The jacket concealed the faint scar on her left shoulder where shrapnel had torn through Kevlar during a firefight in Kandahar province. Her sensible black flats showed no trace of the desert boots that had carried her through 3 combat deployments and countless training exercises where lives depended on her decisions. Nothing about her appearance suggested the woman who had once commanded a forward operating base responsible for securing supply routes through some of Afghanistan's most dangerous territory. No insignia indicated her role as the officer who had developed tactical innovations that saved hundreds of lives and earned her the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for extraordinary heroism in combat. Rebecca paused at the courthouse entrance, watching streams of people flow past security checkpoints with the detached observation skills that remained from years of assessing threats and managing personnel in hostile environments. Lawyers clutched briefcases while discussing cases in hushed tones. Court reporters hurried toward elevators with stenographic equipment. Federal marshals maintained vigilant positions that she recognized from her own experience with high-security operations. She was here as a witness in the court-martial of Major Thomas Harrison, a logistics officer whose alleged embezzlement of Reconstruction funds had created supply shortages that endangered forward bases throughout her former area of operations. The prosecution needed her testimony about operational impacts and security vulnerabilities that had resulted from diverted resources intended for force protection and mission-critical supplies. Ms. Martinez, a young woman in a crisp gray suit, approached with the purposeful stride of a federal prosecutor. "I'm Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chun. Thank you for agreeing to testify today." Rebecca shook hands with Attorney Chun, noting the firm grip and direct eye contact that suggested competence and preparation. "Happy to help ensure accountability, Ms. Chun. Military personnel deserve leaders who honor their responsibilities to the mission and the troops." Chun's expression reflected genuine appreciation for Rebecca's willingness to participate in proceedings that would require detailed testimony about classified operations and personal experiences that most civilians could never fully understand. "Your testimony is crucial for establishing the operational impact of the defendant's actions. The defense will likely challenge your credibility and try to minimize the significance of supply disruptions." "They're welcome to try," Rebecca replied with quiet confidence. "The facts speak for themselves, and I've briefed enough senior officers to handle hostile questioning." What Attorney Chun didn't fully grasp was that Rebecca's military career had included regular testimony before congressional committees, Pentagon review boards, and Inspector General investigations where her analytical capabilities and unshakable integrity had earned respect from officials who typically approached military witnesses with skepticism about self-serving testimony and institutional cover-ups. The security screening process required Rebecca to remove her jacket and place her handbag on the conveyor belt for X-ray examination. The federal security officer conducting the screening was a middle-aged man whose bearing suggested military background, though his civilian uniform provided no indication of service branch or specialty. As Rebecca stepped through the metal detector, the security officer glanced at the X-ray screen displaying her handbag contents, then looked at her with sudden recognition that transformed his professional demeanor into something approaching reverence. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that suggested he knew exactly who she was despite her civilian appearance. "Thank you for your service." Rebecca nodded acknowledgement without elaborating, understanding that some recognition transcended uniform regulations and official protocols. The security officer's reaction suggested her reputation had spread beyond military circles to include federal law enforcement personnel who respected extraordinary service regardless of current employment status. Attorney Chun observed the exchange with curiosity, but didn't comment as they proceeded toward the elevators that would carry them to the courtroom where Rebecca's testimony would help determine Major Harrison's fate. The brief interaction had revealed layers of respect and recognition that weren't immediately apparent from Rebecca's unremarkable civilian appearance. The elevator ride to the 7th floor passed in professional silence, with Attorney Chun reviewing final notes while Rebecca mentally prepared for testimony that would require precise recollection of events that had occurred under extreme stress in combat environments where documentation was often impossible and survival took precedence over administrative procedures. Courtroom 7A was a formal federal facility designed to project the authority and dignity of American justice, with dark wood paneling, elevated judges' bench, and seating arrangements that maintained appropriate separation between prosecution, defense, and public observation areas. The atmosphere carried weight befitting proceedings that would determine criminal liability for actions affecting military operations and personnel safety. As they entered the courtroom, Rebecca immediately noticed several individuals whose posture and bearing indicated military backgrounds despite their civilian attire. Former service members often maintained subtle behavioral patterns that remained recognizable to trained observers years after discharge from active duty, creating invisible bonds of shared experience that transcended current employment or social status. Attorney Chun guided Rebecca to seats in the prosecution area while explaining courtroom procedures and timeline expectations for her testimony. The defense table was occupied by Major Harrison, a thin man in his mid-30s whose expensive civilian suit couldn't disguise the nervous energy that suggested awareness of impending consequences for his alleged crimes. Harrison's defense attorney was an experienced military lawyer whose aggressive reputation included successful defense of senior officers in high-profile cases involving corruption, misconduct, and abuse of authority. His presence indicated that Harrison's case would involve sophisticated legal strategies designed to minimize criminal liability and preserve pension benefits. Judge Patricia Williams entered the courtroom with the measured dignity that characterized federal jurists whose responsibility included ensuring fair proceedings while maintaining appropriate respect for military service and sacrifice. Her own background included Army Reserve service as a military intelligence officer, providing understanding of military culture and operational requirements that would inform her management of the proceedings. "All rise," the bailiff announced with crisp authority that immediately commanded attention throughout the courtroom. Judge Williams took her position at the bench while scanning the assembled participants with the analytical gaze of someone accustomed to managing complex legal proceedings involving classified information and sensitive testimony. As Judge Williams settled into her chair and opened the case file, she glanced toward the prosecution table where Rebecca sat quietly reviewing her testimony notes. Something in Rebecca's bearing caught the judge's attention, a quality of contained authority that wasn't immediately explicable but suggested significance beyond typical witness participation. "Counselors, are you prepared to proceed with witness testimony?" Judge Williams asked, her voice carrying the formal tone appropriate for federal criminal proceedings. "Yes, Your Honor," Attorney Chun replied. "The prosecution calls Rebecca Martinez to the stand." Rebecca rose from her seat and walked toward the witness stand with the measured stride that had once carried her across parade grounds and through hostile territory where confident leadership meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her civilian attire couldn't conceal decades of military bearing that remained embedded in posture, movement, and presence. As she approached the witness stand, something extraordinary began happening throughout the courtroom. In the public gallery, a man in his 50s wearing a Veterans Administration jacket slowly stood at attention. His action was followed by another veteran, then another, until half a dozen former service members were standing in silent recognition of someone whose service they knew transcended normal bounds of military duty. The bailiff, a former Marine whose 20-year career had included deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, noticed the veterans standing and immediately recognized the significance of their spontaneous gesture. Without hesitation, he snapped to attention in a crisp military salute that acknowledged authority and sacrifice that demanded recognition regardless of current uniform status. Judge Williams observed the unprecedented scene unfolding in her courtroom with growing understanding of Rebecca's significance. Military courtrooms occasionally witnessed displays of respect for distinguished service members, but civilian federal courts rarely experienced such spontaneous recognition of extraordinary military achievement and sacrifice. "Ladies and gentlemen," Judge Williams said gently, "please be seated. However, I want to acknowledge the respect being shown for our witness, which reflects the honor and gratitude that military service deserves." Rebecca reached the witness stand and turned to face the courtroom before raising her right hand for the oath administration. As she did so, Judge Williams rose from her bench in an unprecedented gesture of recognition that stunned the assembled attorneys, court personnel, and observers who had never witnessed a federal judge standing to honor a witness. The judge's action created a ripple effect throughout the courtroom as prosecuting and defense attorneys stood in recognition of something larger than typical legal proceedings. Even Major Harrison and his defense team rose from their seats, understanding that they were witnessing recognition of service that transcended the adversarial nature of criminal proceedings. "Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?" The court clerk administered the oath with unusual solemnity that reflected the gravity of the moment. "I do," Rebecca replied with quiet strength that carried across the silent courtroom. As Judge Williams returned to her seat and the courtroom settled into normal proceedings, Attorney Chin began direct examination that would establish Rebecca's credentials and operational experience relevant to the charges against Major Harrison. "Please state your name and current occupation for the record." "Rebecca Martinez. I currently work as a security consultant for international development organizations operating in post-conflict environments." "Ms. Martinez, please describe your military background and qualifications relevant to today's proceedings." Rebecca's response was measured and professional, avoiding unnecessary detail while establishing the scope of experience that qualified her to testify about operational impacts of supply chain corruption and resource misallocation in combat environments. "I served 22 years in the United States Army, retiring as a lieutenant colonel in 2022. My final assignment was commanding officer of Forward Operating Base Mackenzie in Kandahar Province, Afghanistan, responsible for securing supply routes and managing logistics for 12 subordinate bases supporting counterinsurgency operations." Attorney Chin continued establishing Rebecca's qualifications through systematic questioning that revealed layers of responsibility, expertise, and recognition that explained the courtroom's spontaneous display of respect without sensationalizing her achievements or creating unnecessary drama. "During your command at FOB Mackenzie, what were your primary responsibilities regarding supply chain management and resource allocation?" "My responsibilities included coordinating with logistics personnel to ensure adequate supplies of food, water, ammunition, medical equipment, fuel, and construction materials necessary for mission accomplishment and force protection. Supply shortages in forward operating bases can create life-threatening vulnerabilities that compromise both mission effectiveness and personnel safety." Rebecca's testimony continued with technical details about logistics operations, budget oversight, and security implications of resource shortages that demonstrated comprehensive understanding of systems that Major Harrison had allegedly compromised through his embezzlement schemes. Her analytical presentation avoided emotional appeals while establishing clear connections between his actions and operational consequences. "Ms. Martinez, did your base experience supply shortages during the time period covered by the charges against Major Harrison?" "Yes. Beginning in March 2021, we experienced significant shortages of construction materials needed for defensive improvements, medical supplies required for casualty treatment, and fuel necessary for patrol operations. These shortages forced operational modifications that increased risk to personnel while reducing mission effectiveness. Attorney Chen used Rebecca's testimony to establish systematic patterns of resource diversion that had created measurable impacts on multiple bases throughout the region, building a comprehensive case that Major Harrison's alleged crimes had endangered military personnel and compromised national security objectives. Did you investigate the causes of these supply shortages? Yes. My staff conducted comprehensive analysis of supply chain disruptions and identified systematic diversion of funds allocated for force protection and mission-critical supplies. Our investigation revealed patterns suggesting deliberate misallocation rather than normal logistical challenges or enemy action. The direct examination continued for 2 hours, with Rebecca providing detailed testimony about operational impacts, security vulnerabilities, and financial irregularities that supported criminal charges against Major Harrison. Her presentation was methodical and thorough, avoiding dramatic characterizations while establishing facts that spoke to the serious consequences of logistics corruption. When Attorney Chen concluded direct examination, Major Harrison's defense attorney began cross-examination designed to challenge Rebecca's credibility and minimize the significance of supply disruptions she had described. His approach was respectful but aggressive, recognizing that attacking a decorated combat veteran required careful strategy to avoid alienating the judge and jury. Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that supply shortages are common in combat environments and don't necessarily indicate criminal activity? Rebecca's response demonstrated the analytical capabilities that had earned respect throughout her military career. Supply shortages do occur in combat environments due to various factors including enemy action, transportation challenges, and normal logistical complications. However, systematic patterns of specific shortages affecting multiple bases simultaneously suggest deliberate diversion rather than random disruptions. The cross-examination continued with technical questions about logistics procedures, budget oversight, and documentation requirements that revealed Rebecca's comprehensive knowledge of military supply systems and financial accountability measures. Her responses consistently demonstrated competence that exceeded typical witness capabilities while avoiding inflammatory characterizations of the defendant's alleged crimes. Ms. Martinez, do you have personal animosity toward Major Harrison that might influence your testimony? No, I never met Major Harrison personally, and my testimony is based entirely on operational impacts documented through official reports and systematic analysis of supply chain disruptions. My concern is ensuring accountability for actions that endangered military personnel, not personal grievances. The defense attorney's efforts to undermine Rebecca's credibility proved unsuccessful as her testimony remained consistent, well-documented, and professionally presented without emotional appeals or unsupported conclusions. Her analytical approach and comprehensive knowledge of logistics operations validated her expertise while supporting the prosecution's case against Major Harrison. After 3 hours of testimony, Judge Williams called for recess, allowing courtroom participants to process the significance of Rebecca's presentation and the unprecedented display of respect that had marked her appearance as a witness. During the recess, several veterans from the public gallery approached Rebecca to express their gratitude for her service and testimony. Their conversations revealed that her reputation extended far beyond official military circles to include informal networks of veterans who recognized extraordinary leadership and sacrifice even when displayed in civilian clothing. "Ma'am," said a former sergeant whose own deployment to Afghanistan had included operations in Rebecca's area of responsibility, "I served under your command at Firebase Delta in 2021. Your leadership saved lives, and we never forgot what you did for us." Rebecca accepted the recognition graciously while deflecting attention from personal achievements to collective service and sacrifice that characterized military operations. "We all served together, Sergeant. Mission accomplishment and taking care of troops was everyone's responsibility, not just mine." Similar conversations occurred throughout the recess as other veterans shared their own connections to Rebecca's service and expressed appreciation for her willingness to testify in proceedings that would hold corrupt officers accountable for betraying their responsibilities to mission and personnel. When proceedings resumed, Rebecca's testimony concluded with redirect examination that reinforced key points about operational impacts and systemic corruption that had characterized Major Harrison's alleged crimes. Her final statements emphasized the importance of accountability and integrity in military leadership positions where lives depend on faithful execution of duties and responsibilities. Ms. Martinez, based on your experience and analysis, what were the most significant impacts of the supply shortages you described? The most significant impacts were increased risk to personnel who couldn't complete defensive improvements, reduced operational effectiveness due to fuel shortages that limited patrol frequency, and compromised medical capabilities that could have resulted in preventable casualties. Military personnel deserve leaders who honor their responsibilities to mission accomplishment and troop welfare. Rebecca's testimony concluded with Judge Williams thanking her for her service and her willingness to participate in proceedings that upheld military values and accountability standards. The formal conclusion couldn't capture the emotional impact of witnessing recognition that transcended courtroom procedures and legal technicalities. As Rebecca left the witness stand and walked toward the courtroom exit, the same spontaneous recognition occurred in reverse. Veterans throughout the public gallery stood in silent tribute, followed by the bailiff's crisp salute, and concluded with Judge Williams rising from her bench in unprecedented acknowledgement of service that demanded respect regardless of current uniform status. The courtroom doors closed behind Rebecca as she returned to civilian life, but the impact of her testimony and the recognition she had received continued reverberating through legal proceedings that would ultimately result in Major Harrison's conviction and imprisonment for betraying his oath and endangering the troops he was sworn to protect. 3 months later, Major Harrison was sentenced to 8 years in military prison and dismissal from service, with Judge Williams citing Rebecca's testimony as crucial evidence that established both the scope of his crimes and their serious impact on military operations and personnel safety. Attorney Chun, reflecting on the trial and Rebecca's testimony, noted that the spontaneous courtroom recognition had been unprecedented in her 15-year career prosecuting federal cases. Ms. Martinez's appearance demonstrated that some forms of authority and respect transcend official positions and uniform requirements. Her testimony was crucial for achieving justice, but the recognition she received showed that extraordinary service creates lasting bonds that endure long after discharge from active duty. The trial became a case study in military justice education programs, with Rebecca's testimony cited as an example of how witness credibility and expertise could influence complex legal proceedings involving technical military operations and accountability standards that civilian courts rarely encountered. Judge Williams, in subsequent interviews about memorable cases from her judicial career, identified Rebecca's appearance as a defining moment that demonstrated the intersection between military service and civilian justice systems. Ms. Martinez's testimony was professionally excellent, but the courtroom's response revealed something deeper about honor, sacrifice, and recognition that transcends formal procedures and legal technicalities. Today, Rebecca continues her work as a security consultant while remaining connected to veteran communities that recognize her service and leadership contributions. Her civilian career allows her to apply military expertise to international development projects while maintaining the low profile she prefers after decades of public service and command responsibilities. The ribbons remain packed away, and the nameplate is long gone, but the respect and recognition that followed her into that federal courtroom continue wherever veterans gather to share stories of extraordinary leaders who exemplified the best traditions of military service and sacrifice for others. 6 months after the trial that had convicted Major Harrison and sent shockwaves through military logistics commands worldwide, Rebecca found herself facing an unexpected invitation that would test her commitment to remaining in the shadows of civilian life. The Pentagon had requested her testimony before a congressional oversight committee investigating systemic corruption in military contracting and supply chain management. The letter from Congressman Michael Torres, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, arrived on a Tuesday morning at her consulting firm's office in Arlington, Virginia. The official House letterhead and formal language couldn't disguise the urgency behind the request for her expertise in examining patterns of corruption that extended far beyond Major Harrison's individual crimes. Ms. Martinez, the letter began, "Your testimony in United States versus Harrison provided crucial insights into the operational impacts of logistics corruption that Congress needs to understand as we develop legislation to prevent similar betrayals of trust and endangerment of military personnel." Rebecca read the letter twice. Understanding that accepting the invitation would thrust her back into public scrutiny she had spent 18 months avoiding. Her consulting work allowed her to contribute expertise without the ceremony and recognition that had made her uncomfortable during her final years of military service. But the congressional investigation addressed systemic problems that continued endangering troops whose lives depended on supply chains and logistics systems that corrupt officers like Harrison had compromised for personal gain. Her experience commanding forward operating bases provided insights that few civilians possessed about the life-and-death consequences of logistics failures in combat environments. She called Congressman Torres' office that afternoon, speaking with staff members who explained the scope of the investigation and the specific areas where her testimony would address gaps in congressional understanding of military logistics and operational security requirements. "Ms. Martinez," explained Sarah Kim, the committee's chief investigator, "we've identified patterns of corruption involving dozens of officers across multiple service branches. Your experience with the operational impacts helps us understand why these crimes represent national security threats rather than simple financial misconduct." The conversation revealed that Harrison's case had been the beginning rather than the conclusion of investigations that would ultimately expose corruption networks involving hundreds of millions of dollars in diverted funds and compromised military capabilities that affected operations from Afghanistan to training bases throughout the United States. 2 weeks later, Rebecca found herself climbing the marble steps of the Rayburn House office building, where the Armed Services Committee conducted oversight hearings that would influence military policy and budget allocation for years to come. The building's classical architecture projected the gravitas appropriate for congressional proceedings that held military leadership accountable to civilian oversight and democratic principles. Her appearance before Congress would be different from the federal court testimony that had focused on Harrison's specific crimes. Congressional hearings required broader analysis of systemic problems and policy recommendations that could prevent future corruption while maintaining operational effectiveness in challenging environments where military personnel depended on effective logistics support. The committee hearing room was designed for television coverage and public scrutiny, with elevated seating for committee members, witness tables positioned for optimal camera angles, and gallery seating that accommodated media representatives and public observers interested in military oversight and accountability issues. As Rebecca entered the hearing room, she immediately noticed several familiar faces in the gallery: veterans whose own service had been affected by logistics corruption, military family members whose loved ones had been endangered by supply shortages, and defense policy experts whose research had documented the scope of systemic problems in military contracting and accountability. Congressman Torres called the hearing to order with opening remarks that established the investigation's significance for national security and military readiness. His own background as a Navy veteran provided understanding of military culture and operational requirements that informed the committee's approach to examining complex technical issues and institutional problems. Today's hearing addresses corruption in military logistics that has endangered American service members while wasting taxpayer funds intended for national defense, Torres announced. Our witnesses will help the committee understand both the scope of these problems and potential solutions that protect our troops while maintaining fiscal responsibility. The witness panel included Rebecca, a Defense Department Inspector General, and academic experts on military procurement and accountability systems. The diverse perspectives were intended to provide comprehensive analysis of problems that crossed service boundaries and affected everything from combat operations to training exercises and equipment maintenance. When called to testify, Rebecca approached the witness table with the same measured bearing that had characterized her federal court appearance months earlier. The familiar sensation of multiple cameras and intense scrutiny reminded her of Pentagon briefings and congressional budget hearings from her final years of military service. "Ms. Martinez," Congressman Torres began, "please describe for the committee how logistics corruption affects military operations and personnel safety in combat environments." Rebecca's response drew on decades of operational experience and detailed knowledge of supply chain vulnerabilities that few civilians understood. Her testimony avoided technical jargon while explaining complex relationships between resource allocation, operational effectiveness, and the safety of military personnel operating in hostile environments. Congressman Torres, logistics corruption creates multiple layers of risk that compound to threaten both mission success and personnel safety, Rebecca explained. When resources intended for force protection are diverted, bases cannot complete defensive improvements that protect against enemy attacks. When medical supplies are compromised, casualties may become fatalities due to inadequate treatment capabilities. Her systematic analysis continued with specific examples drawn from her command experience, illustrating how supply shortages forced dangerous operational compromises that increased risks while reducing mission effectiveness. The technical details provided committee members with concrete understanding of abstract policy issues that seemed removed from life-and-death realities of military service. During my command at FOB McKenzie, diverted construction funds prevented completion of bunker improvements that would have protected personnel during rocket attacks. Medical supply shortages forced rationing of critical medications that could have meant the difference between recovery and permanent disability for wounded soldiers. Committee members asked detailed questions about oversight procedures, accountability mechanisms, and policy changes that could prevent future corruption while maintaining operational flexibility necessary for military effectiveness in unpredictable environments. Rebecca's responses demonstrated comprehensive understanding of both operational requirements and administrative systems. Representative Sarah Johnson, whose district included major military installations, asked about the broader implications of logistics corruption for military readiness and national security capabilities. Ms. Martinez, beyond immediate operational impacts, how does logistics corruption affect overall military preparedness and our ability to respond to national security threats? Rebecca's answer addressed strategic implications that extended beyond individual cases to systemic vulnerabilities that could affect America's ability to project power and maintain security commitments worldwide. Representative Johnson, logistics corruption undermines the foundation of military effectiveness by creating unreliable supply chains that cannot support sustained operations. When commanders cannot depend on promised resources, they must develop workarounds that reduce efficiency while increasing costs and risks. The hearing continued for 4 hours, with Rebecca's testimony providing detailed analysis of corruption patterns, operational impacts, and policy recommendations that would influence legislation addressing military accountability and logistics reform. Her expertise bridged the gap between complex technical issues and practical solutions that could protect both taxpayer funds and military personnel. During breaks in the formal proceedings, several committee members approached Rebecca privately to discuss specific aspects of military logistics and corruption prevention that required deeper understanding than public hearings could provide. These conversations revealed the complexity of balancing oversight requirements with operational security and military effectiveness. Representative Michael Chun, whose son served in the Army, expressed particular appreciation for Rebecca's willingness to explain technical issues in terms that civilians could understand while maintaining respect for military service and sacrifice. Ms. Martinez, your testimony helps us understand why these aren't just financial crimes, but betrayals of trust that endanger the troops we've sent into harm's way. That perspective is crucial for developing effective legislation that serves both accountability and operational requirements. The congressional testimony concluded with Rebecca's recommendations for policy changes that could prevent future corruption while maintaining the flexibility and efficiency necessary for effective military logistics in challenging operational environments. Her proposals reflected comprehensive understanding of both administrative systems and operational realities. 3 months after the congressional hearing, the Armed Services Committee released a comprehensive report on military logistics corruption that incorporated Rebecca's testimony and recommendations into legislation requiring enhanced oversight and accountability measures for military contracting and supply chain management. The Martinez Act, named in recognition of her contributions to understanding and preventing military logistics corruption, established new requirements for financial transparency, operational impact assessment, and criminal penalties for officers who betrayed their responsibilities to mission and personnel through corrupt practices. Representative Torres, announcing the legislation's introduction, credited Rebecca's expertise with providing the technical foundation and operational perspective necessary for developing effective solutions to complex institutional problems. Ms. Martinez's testimony demonstrated that logistics corruption isn't an abstract policy issue, but a betrayal of trust that endangers American service members. Her insights helped us develop legislation that protects both our troops and taxpayer resources while maintaining the operational effectiveness our military requires. The legislation passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support, reflecting widespread recognition that military logistics corruption represented a national security threat. Requiring comprehensive solutions that addressed both individual accountability and systemic vulnerabilities. 6 months after the Martinez Act became law, Rebecca received another unexpected recognition when the Veterans of Foreign Wars announced her selection for their highest civilian honor, the VFW Gold Medal of Merit, recognizing her contributions to veteran welfare and military accountability through her testimony and policy advocacy. The award ceremony at the VFW National Convention in Kansas City brought together thousands of veterans whose own service had been affected by the corruption issues that Rebecca's testimony had helped address. The recognition represented acknowledgement from the veteran community that her civilian advocacy continued the service that had characterized her military career. Rebecca Martinez exemplifies the best traditions of military service by continuing to fight for the troops even after hanging up her uniform, announced VFW National Commander James Sullivan during the award presentation. Her courage in speaking truth to power protects the next generation of service members from corruption that betrays their sacrifice. The standing ovation that greeted Rebecca as she approached the podium replicated the spontaneous recognition she had received in the federal courtroom, but on a scale that included thousands of veterans whose own service connected them to the leadership and sacrifice she represented. Her acceptance speech emphasized collective service rather than individual achievement, deflecting attention from personal recognition to systematic efforts required for protecting military personnel and maintaining institutional integrity that served national security objectives. This recognition belongs to every service member whose dedication to mission and troops creates the standards that make corruption unacceptable, Rebecca told the assembled veterans. My testimony was possible only because of collective service that demands accountability from leaders entrusted with resources and lives. The VFW recognition led to additional speaking invitations from veteran organizations, military educational institutions, and policy groups seeking her expertise on issues ranging from logistics reform to veteran transition assistance and civilian-military relations in democratic societies. Rebecca carefully selected engagements that contributed to policy development and veteran welfare while avoiding celebrity status that felt inconsistent with her preference for substance over recognition. Her speaking schedule focused on technical expertise and practical solutions rather than personal narratives or emotional appeals. A year after receiving the VFW Gold Medal, Rebecca was invited to join the board of directors for the Military Family Support Foundation, where her operational experience and policy expertise contributed to programs assisting families affected by deployment stress, combat injuries, and transition challenges. Her board service reflected recognition that military expertise remained valuable for civilian organizations addressing veteran and family issues that required understanding of military culture, operational realities, and the unique challenges facing service members and their families in contemporary society. The foundation work allowed Rebecca to contribute to veteran welfare through policy development and program design rather than public recognition or ceremonial roles that made her uncomfortable. Her systematic approach to organizational effectiveness enhanced programs serving thousands of military families nationwide. Today, Rebecca continues her consulting work while serving on nonprofit boards that address veteran issues and military policy reform. Her civilian career demonstrates how military leadership and technical expertise can contribute to society through channels that maintain professional effectiveness while avoiding public attention. The courtroom recognition that had surprised her 3 years earlier continues wherever veterans recognize leadership that transcended uniform requirements and official positions. Her story demonstrates that some forms of service create lasting bonds that endure long after discharge papers are signed and ribbons are packed away. The federal courthouse where she testified remains a symbol of civilian oversight and military accountability, while the congressional hearing room, where she provided policy expertise, represents democratic institutions that depend on military professionals willing to speak truth about institutional problems that affect national security and troop welfare. Rebecca's influence on policy and veteran advocacy continues through legislation, programs, and institutional changes that protect military personnel while maintaining operational effectiveness necessary for national defense. Her quiet leadership demonstrates that the most significant service often occurs away from ceremonies and recognition, in committee rooms and policy discussions where expertise and integrity influence decisions affecting thousands of lives. The woman who walked into that courtroom in civilian clothes proved that authority and respect transcend uniform requirements, while her subsequent policy advocacy demonstrates how military expertise can serve democratic institutions and veteran welfare through civilian channels that maintain professional effectiveness without requiring public recognition or ceremonial display.